Well, speaking, I was just thinking about something that is very close to Warhol, but actually happened earlier, and I think maybe she actually was a model for him here in South America, would be Eva Perón. And she died before I was, well, maybe I was born already, but you look at that and the story here of this woman who came from nothing, who was a dance hall girl, probably a prostitute, and she hooked up with Juan Perón, who had his own ambitions to be the president of Argentina. And she recreates herself as this, you know, and in the musical, if any of you have seen the movie, or the Evita, and she becomes this queen. And I know there was an historical moment there. I remember when Perón is speaking to the crowd of all the workers who were struggling against the regime at the time. And I think the term in Spanish is descaminados. And she says to him, take your jacket off, look like one of them. And I think the reason I bring that up is not just to have a Latin context, but the notion that what Warhol understood with that very much was, it didn't matter whether Perón was really good, whether smart, or honest. He branded himself, as we now say in marketing and advertising. I look like one of you guys on the street. I understand you. I've been where you are. I mean, he himself had been a general. He was not the cleanest of people. But people said, wow, he looks more like us, and he sounds more like us. He sounded angry. And then here is pure Evita, who, as we know, was a monster. And then, luckily for her, she died. I mean, this sounds terrible. She died before people really found out how terrible she was. So she was buried, and they took her body away, put it someplace, and they brought it back. And supposedly she was embalmed, so like Lenin, you know, she'll never turn old. So there's this myth that here was this horrible woman, mean woman with this not very good president, in my opinion, but that the myth to the outside world, and it's just like the myth that Warhol saw in our own country of the Kennedys. As we look now, President Kennedy probably wasn't the world's most wonderful president in terms of his genius or his political stances or his morals. But he was young, and Mrs. Kennedy was young, and America wanted beauty. And we remember in the news that when I was a kid, Mrs. Kennedy going to Europe and charming Charles de Gaulle. And it was about this branding of a new world. America had helped win the war. And now we were to be the grand new nation. Part of that was true, part of it economic, but part of it was just wrapping, just packaging. And I think one of the things Warhol realized was that in this post-war, post-Second World world, nothing was seen uninflected. And by that I mean any election in your country or in ours or in anywhere in the world, any product you sell is sold. There was a phrase in the 1950s, many people don't realize that when Warhol left Pittsburgh, he came to New York, and for 15 years, Phillip mentioned this a little bit, he worked for advertisers and graphic designers. He became the most popular graphic designer in New York. And what he did was he sold this adage, and it was something that he learned from other people. It's not that Warhol came up with this, but was said in advertising, and I hope this translates well into Spanish, sell the sizzle and not the steak. So if in an ad on the radio you're trying to sell beef, like some wonderful beef I've just been enjoying here in Colombia, and someone's telling you, buy this beef, and you hear on the radio, and you think there's that wonderful beef that, well, you've paid for it, and once you take it home, it may taste like shoe leather. But people have bought it because you sold the sizzle and not the steak. Or another one of the adages was, give the lady what she wants. The customer is always right. So make that person feel so comfortable in your store as your politician, as your movie star, that really you are deluding them. Sometimes, like Perón, you have a Perón in an evil way, sometimes in a way that's very different. Now, wow, end with one thing here. Some of you, if you watch BBC TV or go on YouTube, there was this story just about 3 weeks ago of this very fat, ugly English lady named Susan Boyle, who went on to this British show. None of you are nodding. She had 100 million hits on the radio. And she opened her mouth, and everyone said, oh my God. And I said, Warhol, if Warhol was alive, he would have painted her picture. Because that was this notion of someone who looks like someone who's foolish and fat and looks like your aunt who you don't like. And then she opens her mouth, and the world changes. And she had her 15 minutes of fame. He would have loved that.
I think that also touches on the idea that Warhol in his factory went through a succession of sort of girls of the year. He started with, I guess, Baby Jane Holzer would really be the first, then Edie Sedgwick most famously, Ultraviolet, Nico, Viva. And Warhol, you know, as with stars, I think Warhol had a capacity for a passionate idealization, and then could be quite ruthless in a sense when he felt that someone had disappointed him. And in a lot of cases, he would feel that, you know, somehow, you know, Edie Sedgwick was kind of on her way out. She was on drugs. She wasn't showing up on time. We need to get rid of her. And so, and this appeared to the outside world as quite ruthless. But I think of it as kind of like an American businessman's sense of when a product has kind of reached its peak or is about to pass its peak. And Warhol's and at the same time, I think his capacity for, you know, for this idealization and then disillusion was very real. It was probably the most prominent dynamic in his psychic life in terms of his relationships to other people. And of course, the price of it was always maintaining, as Tom said earlier, a certain distance to other people. Warhol was a classic voyeur. He liked to look at things, not just in the, you know, in the general sense of a scopophiliac who, you know, like, oh, I like this girl's knee, or, you know, I like his arm, something like that. Warhol, you know, the price of his kind of libidinal investment in an object was precisely that he maintained his distance from it. To get closer to it would be to destroy it in some way. And so I see Warhol as kind of, you know, treading this sort of, I see him as kind of articulating an idea about the need to have myths, to have a passionate identification with something. As Tom was saying, you know, sell the sizzle, not the steak. You know, to some extent, the American, I mean, the entire American project, both domestically and in its imperial projection around the world, is predicated on the dissemination and manipulation of images. It's really an image war. The American hegemony is built not predominantly on military power, although that's a major component of it, but on the successful selling of America as a brand to the rest of the world. The American dream is universal or can be made universal. There are obviously people who resist that. Those people are hateful. They need to be, you know, eliminated. But most people, you know, as General Westmoreland said during the Vietnam War, inside of every Vietnamese, there's a potential American. This universalist cast of mind is something that was very, I would say, is very familiar to Warhol. It has to do with the public sphere and the way in which, you know, to some extent, everything was kind of being melted down, you know, to a kind of general language of images. And you know, the United States has only been the most spectacularly successful example of that.